An Acceptable Time by Madeleine L'Engle, Chapter 7. She jerked upright, as though out of sleep. She looked around. There was no silver circlet with crescent moon. She wore only her damp nightgown. The pool rippled in the starlight. The moon was gone. The distant sound of the village church bell came to her, 12 notes, blown and distorted by the wind. She shivered. All she knew was that it had not been a dream. When Polly woke up, it was broad daylight and the sun was streaming into her room. She lay in bed debating. How could she explain to her grandparents what had happened to her? On Samhain, All Hallows Eve, it was over. Today was Friday, All Souls Day. She heard them coming up from the pool. She dressed and went downstairs, feeling weary and anxious. Coffee was still dripping through the filter onto the glass carafe. She got a mug from the dresser. The Ogham stones were still there. She wondered where her grandmother was going to take them. She waited till the coffee had stopped dripping, then filled her mug and added milk. She was too tired to make café au lait. Her grandparents came downstairs and into the kitchen, greeted her, then, "What's the matter?" She started to spill out her story. "Wait," her grandfather said, and poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat at his place. Her grandmother, too, sat down. "Go on." They listened without interrupting. They did not tell her she should not have gone down to the pool. When they had finished, they looked at each other. "We'd better call Nays," her grandfather said. While they were waiting for the bishop, they had breakfast. Mrs. Murray had made oatmeal the night before, and it was on the back of the stove, hot over a double boiler. Automatically, she set out brown sugar, raisins, milk. "Help yourselves." "I don't like the implications of this," Mr. Murray said. "There seems to be no way we can protect Polly, except by chaining her to one of us." They stopped talking as they heard urgent barking outside. Mr. Murray put his hand to his forehead. "I'd almost forgotten." He went out through the pantry door and came in with the dog, who pranced about excitedly. "Polly, is this Corralis's dog?" "I think so." Mr. Murray shook his head, went back out to the garage, and returned with the blanket, which he put down near the wood stove. The dog flopped down on it, tail thumping, and Hadron leaped upon him, playing with his tail as though with a mouse. The dog sighed with resignation. 3,000 years ago doesn't seem to make much difference to Hadron," he said. "Somehow I find that comforting, but maybe I'm grasping at straws." The bishop arrived with Dr. Louise. "I want to make sure that sanity outweighs my brother's fantasy," she said. "I don't have to be at the hospital for another hour." "The dog's still here." The bishop petted the animal's head, stroked the great ears. "He was with Corralis last night," Polly said, whenever last night was. "Have you had breakfast?" Mrs. Murray asked. "Long ago," Dr. Louise replied. The bishop looked at the stove. "Very long ago." Mrs. Murray handed him a bowl. "Help yourself, Nason. It's only oatmeal this morning." He filled his bowl, heaped on brown sugar and raisins, added milk, and sat at the table. "I find it comforting that the dog is here. I'm sure he's protection. Now, Polly, tell me exactly what happened last night. Don't leave anything out." "I couldn't sleep," she started, "and it was as though the pool was pulling me. I can't explain. I knew I shouldn't go to the pool. I didn't want to go to the pool, but it kept pulling me, and I went." The bishop listened carefully, eating all the while, looking up as she described the silver circlet with the crescent moon. "Surely," he said, "a symbol of the moon goddess. You said Annie had one too?" "Yes." "The moon goddess and the mother, the earth. What we have, you see, is a mixture of Native Americans and Celtic traditions. They overlap in many ways. Go on." After a while, Mr. Murray interrupted. "You say that Corralis and this other person, Tav, have been here in the New World only 3 years?" "I think so, Granddad. That's what Honorol and Corralis both said." The bishop nodded. "Yes, that's what they told me. I've paid less attention to time than to the trip. Corralis and Tav came in a boat. Of course, that would not be possible now, with the lake long gone, along with the rest of the melt from the glaciers. But 3,000 years ago, it's quite possible that one could have come first across the ocean, and then by the rivers, and probably what are merely brooks and streams now would have been sizable rivers then, and so get to the lake and to this place. What do you think, Alex?" "Possibly," Mr. Murray agreed. "Once they'd landed on this continent, they could probably have made their way inland in some kind of small boat." It's the ocean crossing that's hard to understand," Dr. Louise said. People did cross the oceans, remember? Her brother said. Navigating by the stars, and the Druids were astronomers. The bishop helped himself to more oatmeal. Go on, Polly. When she had finished, the bishop's bowl was again empty. All right, so you were part of the Samhain remembrance of the people of the wind. And Keralis and Tav were assimilated by the native people. The people of the wind? Mr. Murray asked. Keralis became their new leader, the bishop said. He and Tav were blown across the lake by a hurricane, which in itself would have seemed an omen. He took a handful of raisins. Keralis and Tav were each sent from Britain for opposite heresies. Keralis for refusal to shed blood, and Tav not so much for shedding it as for performing the sacrifice that should have been done by a druid. Tav believed that human sacrifice was demanded, that the earth cried out for blood, and he acted accordingly. Polly. Blood. Mr. Murray's voice was heavy. He's thinking of Polly. Until her grandfather had put it thus baldly, Polly had not quite absorbed the importance of Tav's words from the night before. Mrs. Murray asked, Was blood sacrifice part of the Druidic ritual? It's not been proven, the bishop said. There is a theory that it was believed the Earth Mother demanded blood, and that each year, perhaps at Samhain, there was a human sacrifice. If possible, it was a prisoner. If not, then someone, usually the weakest in the tribe, would be laid on the altar and blood given to the ground. Polly shivered. What about the skulls? Dr. Louise asked. That, I understand, was common practice among some of the tribes. The skulls of the enemies were placed on high poles in a circle around the altar, or the standing stones. Remember, these were Stone Age people, and their thinking was very different from ours. Bloodthirsty, Dr. Louise stated. The bishop asked mildly, Any more bloodthirsty than incinerating people with napalm or hydrogen bombs? We appear to be bloodthirsty creatures, we so-called human beings, and peacemakers like Keralis are in the minority, I fear. Meanwhile, Mr. Murray demanded, what about Polly? Samhain is over, the bishop said. Keralis was able to send Polly safely home. You think the danger is over? The bishop nodded. It should be. The time has passed. The dog rose from the blanket and came over to Polly, sitting beside her and laying his head on her knee. She put her hand on his neck, which felt strong and warm. His hair, while not long, was soft. The bishop nodded again. Keralis and Annie will protect Polly. Keralis has sent his dog. Mr. Murray spoke sharply. It's not necessarily the same dog. I don't want Polly to see them again, not any of them. And as soon as your time gate is closed, I want Polly away from here. But, Granddad, if the time gate is closed, then there isn't any problem, and we don't have to worry about the Tesseract one way or the other. The bishop agreed, then said, Samhain is over. This is All Souls' Day, when we remember those who have gone before. It is a quiet day when we can let our grief turn to peace. Nathan, Mrs. Murray's voice grated, what do we do now? Can you guarantee that the danger to Polly is over? The bishop gazed at the last raisin in his bowl as though searching for an answer. I don't know. If it weren't for that young man Zachary. What about him? His part in all this, whatever it is, has not been played out. Mrs. Murray asked quietly, Is Polly still in the Tesseract? Again the bishop stared at the raisin. There are too many questions still unresolved. Is that an answer? I don't know. The bishop looked at Mr. Murray. I don't understand your Tesseract. Polly has been through the time gate, and if I am the one who opened it, forgive me. Bishop, Polly interrupted. Tav, what about Tav? Tav has reason for concern. There are neighboring tribes which are not peaceable as the people of the wind, which are not as peaceable as the people of the wind. There have been several summers of drought, far more severe across the lake, where there is no underground river to be tapped for irrigation. Raids have already begun. This land is eminently desirable. Tav is ready to fight to protect it. Is Keralis? Mr. Murray asked. I'm not sure. The bishop rubbed his forehead. He seeks peace, but peace is not easy to maintain single-handed. Mr. Murray went to the dresser. I wish you'd never found the Ogham stones or opened the time gate. It was inadvertent. It was nothing I planned. No, you opened the time gate thoroughly when you brought Annie to Louise. Mr. Murray's voice was level, but it was an accusation nevertheless. Dr. Louise said quickly. She would have lost the use of her forefinger. She would have lost the use of a forefinger. Infection would probably have set in if I had not used antibiotics. What might seem like a simple slip of the knife could well have proved fatal. Mrs. Murray smiled slightly. Brother and sister do stick together when push comes to shove, she murmured to Polly. Anyhow, Alex, you and I were fascinated, disbelieving but fascinated until Polly was involved. Mr. Murray asked, Is it safe for us to send Polly home to Benedict Island? No, Polly started, but the bishop interrupted, raising his hand authoritatively. I think not yet. Things have to be played out. But meanwhile, we will keep her safe. One of us must be with her at all times to prevent a reoccurrence of last night. Not you, please, Nays, Mrs. Murray said. Sorry, but it's you who opened the gate. You're probably right, the bishop conceded. But you, my dear, and Alex, just be with her. What would happen, Mr. Murray suggested, if you sealed up the root cellar? Nothing, I fear. It was simply the closest root cellar to the star-watching rock and the place of your pool. These are the holy places. Holy? Dr. Louise asked. Sacred. We have lost a sense of the sacredness of space as we have settled for the literal and provable. We remember a few of the sacred spaces, such as Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, or Glastonbury Abbey. Mount Moriah was holy before ever Abraham took Isaac there. So was Bethel, the house of God, before Jacob had his dream, or before the Ark of the Covenant was briefly located there, according to Judges. Nays, his sister said softly. You're getting in the pulpit again. But he went on. One theory is that such sacred spaces were connected by ley lines. She interrupted. Nays, what on earth are ley lines? They are lines of electromagnetic power, well documented in England, leading from one holy place to another, lines of energy. I suspect that there is a ley line between the root cellar and the star-watching rock, between the star-watching rock and the pool. What faddish rubbish, his sister said. But Polly remembered Corrales talking about lines between the stars, lines between people, lines between places, between people. It did not seem like rubbish. It can become a fad, the bishop told his sister, but that doesn't make the original holiness any less holy. I don't want you falling for fads in your old age, Dr. Louise warned. Louise, I didn't ask for any of this. I wasn't looking for Ogham stones, but they can hardly be classified as rubbish. I had no idea that your root cellar was in fact not a root cellar at all. I didn't expect 3,000 years to be bridged by Annie, but Annie is a lonely, innocent creature, and I feel a distinct responsibility toward her. How can you be responsible for someone who has been dead for approximately 3,000 years? Dr. Louise demanded. Her story is already told. Kaput, finished. Is it? The bishop whispered. Is it? And we'll pause there.